Are Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni good? What about Jeffery Lurie and Nick Sirianni? We got an inside look at the top relationships from the Philadelphia Eagles during Tuesday's press conferences. We'll get into that and more coming up on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Eagles fans? I'm Louis DiBiase, co-host of the Locked On Eagles podcast. You can find my work also over at Bleacher Report. He's Gino Camilleri, our scouting director, Eagles analyst, also over at Bleacher Report, and my co-host. On today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, head coach Nick Sirianni, he had a lot to say specifically about culture on Tuesday during his press conference with the media. Will that culture improve in 2024? Plus takeaways from owner Jeffery Lurie and a look at the latest rule changes across the NFL. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDON in all capital letters for $20 off your first purchase. Lots of interesting stuff coming from the head coach and the owner today. The general manager, Howie Roseman, he spoke with the media yesterday. And Gino, when it comes to, I feel like all three guys had different themes with what they were really trying to highlight. Also, of course, what they were asked by the media. All three completely different roles at the top of this organization. But with Nick Sirianni, I thought it was really interesting how much he highlighted culture. Like, that's something we've always known for Sirianni was his bread and butter. It's what made him be somebody the Eagles wanted as head coach, even after 2021 when he gave up play calling duty to Shane Steichen. But it was interesting to see him be honest about the culture last year and how the one quote I really took away from it was he's looking forward to getting back to the close team that they previously were. And this came after a Chauncey Gardner-Johnson question talking about how, that mentality, that swagger coming back to the defense will be huge for this team. And I think it's interesting that he kind of shed a little light into the locker room. I think that was, we've known it ourselves. You could see it on the TV that there was an issue with culture and just a confidence and mentality problem with this team.
Stick with me on this one. One of my favorite Adam Sandler movies, and I'm sure it's a lot of people, is Billy Madison, right? And there's a scene when he goes back to school and one of his teachers is reading him a book, and it's called The Puppy Who Lost Its Way. That's what the Philadelphia Eagles felt like in 2023, if we're being honest, Lou, and especially in that second half of the season. That team lost their way from who they were. They lost their way on how they dominated the line of scrimmage. They weren't truly who they were in terms of pushing and getting any sort of yardage in the run game. They were bottom of the barrel. Their defensive line couldn't stop a nosebleed. They're allowing the Arizona Cardinals to put up ridiculous numbers on them. And you're saying a year ago, this team was back to who they were from the early 2000s and the early 90s, and these teams that you were feared when you came into Lincoln Financial Field. Like, that defense was really, really good. And I know we talk a lot of bad about Jonathan Gannon, but man, he put together a heck of a performance with that group that he had, and took two guys to try to put together a semblance of a defense last year. And Jeffery Lurie, I think he put it perfectly between the dynamic of how he looked at that situation with how they moved to the defensive coordinator position. He kind of just said, hey, it wasn't working. They gave it a shot. It's time to move on. I think everybody is ready to get over that 2023 season. I think everybody, including us, the fans, Jeffery Lurie, Howie Roseman, Nick Sirianni, anybody who's talked about it, they weren't who they were. They were the Eagles who lost their way. They were not the same team that we saw that calendar year, the year before that. Jeffery Lurie continued to just go back to how great they were in the regular season up until that stretch, how great they were in the playoffs up until that stretch. And you eliminate that, things have been relatively good in Philadelphia. So you just have to get back on track. And I think a lot of the moves that they have already made are getting this team on that trajectory to where they want to be. And what is that, Lou? It's to compete for a Super Bowl year in and year out.
And it was interesting that you said that they lost their way, because that's what was so surprising about this football team. And Nick Sirianni talked about it. Jeffery Lurie even mentioned the lack of resiliency at the end of the year and how the Eagles normally, their bread and butter was when things got really bad, when they got backed into a corner, that is when they played their best ball. 2017, 2018, 2019, 2021. They are always overcoming adversity, and last year it didn't happen. And we've both mentioned this on the show. It was very surprising because we thought they had the right makeup, not just, of course, the guys that have done it before, like Fletcher Cox, Jason Kelce, Lane Johnson, Brandon Graham, but you look at the young core. It was surprising the way they unraveled, the way Jalen Hurts unraveled, and A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Jalen Carter. I mean, these guys from Alabama and Georgia and players that have played in some huge games early on in their career at the NFL level, it was very surprising. And Sirianni mentioned those young players need to bounce back and step up as leaders because now, guess what? This year, you don't have Jason Kelce to help you through that adversity. You don't have Fletcher Cox. Sure, you still got Lane and BG, but those guys cannot check out mentally the way they did at the end of the year because it's on them now. They're the captains of this football team.
And it's not just when it has to happen, it's it needs to happen sort of thing.
They're the leaders.
The passing of the torch, it's here. I mean, we're not waiting. It's not like when they want to bring the Olympic torch across the country and you're somebody in the middle of Nebraska waiting for it to come from California. Like, no, dude, you're in a 4x100 sprint and you're in the second leg of this thing right now. Like those guys, Jalen Carter going into his second year, Jordan Davis going into his third year. These guys have to step up in a big way. You look at the young offensive linemen. Look at Cam Jurgens, whose shoes he has to go and fill.
Sirianni mentioned, too, specifically the great leadership of Landon Dickerson and Jordan Mailata. Like, those guys got to replace Kelce vocally, too.
And I think those guys have been rewarded because of a lot of what they do in that element as well. And to be somebody that plays offensive line for the Eagles, I think leadership above everything is going to take them far at that position. And you see how Jordan Mailata, even when he's on like the podcast with the Kelce brothers, New Heights, when he's just interacting with guys like Lane and Jason Kelce, how he just talks about what it means to play that position, right? And I think the sentiment of all of what Jeffrey and Nick were saying was they want to get back to playing Philadelphia Eagles football. Now, saying it is one thing. Going out there and doing it for 17 games in the regular season and then potentially 3 more in the playoffs, this is the cutting room floor now, Nick Sirianni. This is the season. You talk about wanting to be evaluated. This is the year Nick is going to truly be evaluated, because how do you bounce back from that after you already had those expectations? Jeffery Lurie mentioned those high. I don't know why I said Jeffery Lurie's name like that. That bugged me. Sorry, I had to note that. But Jeffery Lurie mentioned the high points of Nick Sirianni when he turned over the play calling to Shane Steichen, how he turned around and he goes 30 and whatever in the regular season over that next stretch. And then he took a risk and gave Matt Patricia that play calling ability, but it didn't pay off. This is the grudge match round, Lou. Like, there's one more decision that Nick Sirianni could make that either could make him look like a genius or could land him off on Black Monday when all of the guys get fired.
And he needs those young players to step up both on the field and off. He mentioned specifically the leadership of Jalen Hurts, Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown. Those guys were already captains last year. But again, he highlighted new players stepping up. He's excited to see who are going to be those new vocal leaders. Landon Dickerson, Jordan Mailata. Howie Roseman has mentioned Nakobe Dean in the past as somebody that can be one of those guys if he is emerged as an every down linebacker, a captain of this defense. So, this was a young core that I truly believed could be the ones that grab that torch from the veterans. I still have confidence in them because they've shown in the past they can be great leaders in college, in the NFL, but definitely a little more skeptical after last year. Like, Gino, they have to go out there and prove it this time around.
Yeah, fool me once, shame on me, fool me
the
twice.
The benefit of the doubt isn't there
right?
as much. I mean, I'm not like all hope is lost. These guys normally are great leaders, but again, last year at the end, like that put a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths.
Yeah, and I said that quote backwards again, man. I'm killing it right now. But 100%, it did irk me a little bit too. And like, why are we having a referendum on the edge position when these guys were such great players for a year and a half the year prior? Like, why are we having
why is
these
Nick
questions?
Sirianni and Jalen Hurts? Like, I know Jalen Hurts had every reason to be upset with Sirianni at the end of the year, but why today when Sirianni mentioned like their relationship, was he still kind of dodging it and going back to just the team? Like, it didn't really sound like their relationship is great right now. There's just a lot of things that I feel like were over dramatized at the end of the year. And again, I'm not like just discounting the collapse, but I mean, they got to get back to, like you said, it's a team that lost their way. It's not a team that just doesn't have it anymore. This is not the 2020 Philadelphia Eagles.
No, this wasn't the 2016 start where they're 3-0 and you're like, okay, this thing has to come back to earth at some point, right? You overperformed and then it came crashing down. This crash came out of nowhere. It truly was, oh, this thing is kind of like the Titanic. We don't believe it can go down, but all of a sudden we're not watching and boom, out comes that iceberg, and then you lose the rest of the games along the way and you're getting blown out in the playoffs once again, right? So this team has to get back on track. Talking is one thing. It is March 26th, right? They're going to bring more guys into this building that hopefully fit that culture as well. There's opportunities for more young players to step in. But right now, it is a pivotal moment in this franchise when it comes to a turnover of the leadership. Good thing Brandon Graham is still there. You still have, I mean, heck, dude, Jake Elliott, you have to give hats off to him, man. He was on that Super Bowl team. He gets respect as well. There are guys in that building that earn their respect, and those guys younger than them, they got to go out there and earn it as well, because Philadelphia, it can flip very fast. And if you have a breakdown like that again, people aren't going to be that forgiving. They're going to say, yeah, you fooled me the first time. Shame on you. Fooled me the second time. Shame on me. See, I did it right there.
There you go. I will say Jeffery Lurie sounded a lot more confident in Nick Sirianni than maybe some would have predicted. So we'll get into some takeaways from Lurie's press conference coming up next, right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. You should not have to worry when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Game Time is the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. See the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. All-in prices show your total up front, so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. Buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. They're obsessed with finding ways to help you save money on tickets and make it so much easier. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem our code LOCKEDON for $20 off your tickets. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, got to turn down the volume with all that shouting. We'll make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The Eagles media, Philadelphia media, I should say, they don't really get a chance to talk to owner Jeffery Lurie a whole lot. And this is the time of year, Gino, when we get to hear from the number one guy in the organization at the meetings down in Florida. And today, he was, of course, asked instantly what went into the decision to retain Nick Sirianni heading into the 2024 season. And Lurie, I was surprised by, maybe I shouldn't say surprised, but maybe surprised more than heading into the year. They kept Sirianni, so obviously they're confident in that decision. But he really went in on the positives of Nick, talking about his 31-7 record before the collapse, his authenticity, his football IQ, his ability to connect and be a hands-on coach, and how he admires that Sirianni has taken some really big leaps, some risks in season that other coaches wouldn't, like getting rid of play calling, firing a defensive coordinator. He says he really likes the plan long-term. I just was surprised that it just felt like he was very confident despite that collapse. Not saying he overlooked the collapse, but the tone was almost as if we just got out of the 2022 season.
The one thing that Jeffery Lurie does very well is he focuses on what individuals in his organization can do very, very well. Look at Howie Roseman, right? There are negative things that you can say about him, and anybody can pinpoint everything negative about Howie Roseman, about Nick Sirianni, right? But only the good ones can find what they do well. And that goes into finding football players, that goes into finding people in the personnel department. It goes into every facet of this sport. Find what people do well. And I love that he focused on what Nick Sirianni does well, because anybody can rip this guy apart. They do. And Elliott Shore-Parks tried to just walk Jeffery Lurie into a question and say, does the dramatics on the sideline like make him look like a bad coach, essentially? And it was, in my opinion, a leading question. And Jeffery Lurie was very professional about it. And he says, no, I think it's one thing that's who he is. That's his passion. And that's what makes him great. Do you want to take off the refs? No, absolutely not. But you can't take that element away from who Nick is. That's what I want to hear from your owner. I don't want to hear the negative things and everybody work in fear. Like, to hear him say that even going with Matt Patricia was a risk that he was okay with, even though it didn't pay off. That's life, man. It's going to be full of risks. It's going to be full of times when you don't know what to do, but you can't do nothing. And that's what Nick Sirianni, I think, does best, is that he will take action. He did it back in his first season with Shane Steichen. He did it last year. Whether it worked or not, he is not going to sit on his hands. And I think that's what Howie Roseman does really well. That's
where the trust still is, I think.
Yeah, there is an element of trust that I don't think has gone away. I think there's an element now more of the accountability. Like, hey, Nick. Like,
yeah, the leash is tighter for sure.
Yeah, the leash is definitely tight. I don't think he's on the hot seat, but it's a tighter leash, I will say.
He did mention that he was disappointed at the lack of resiliency at the end of the year. Like, he tried to make sure, he pointed out after hyping up Sirianni for what felt like 5 minutes, that he isn't overlooking that collapse, because 100%. It is one of the biggest collapses of a contender, if not the biggest collapse in NFL history. But I think where the trust still lies is, I think he's trying to be more patient than he was maybe with Doug Peterson. But the difference between Doug and Sirianni here is that one was willing to make dramatic change and maybe even listen to the input of the owner and the GM. I still believe that had more to do with these moves than it was. Lurie said it was all Sirianni. I have a little hard time believing that it was just Nick's decision. But I will say that at the same time, Lurie has some good points that Sirianni, outside of that final 6 games, has a pretty damn good track record in Philadelphia. A 31-7 record is not something to overlook. And so, yeah, I mean, everybody knows if they listen to the show that I personally wanted to move on, but in a vacuum, I like that he's preaching patience and not being sometimes the impulsive, takeover guy that we've thought and we've heard stories about him being in the past.
Yeah, and especially when you hear, organizations like Carolina with the Dave Tepper situation, man. Imagine if we're covering that show, how just toxic that environment would be. And legitimately, one of the reasons I enjoy covering this team is because of how they operate as a team. And like, one of the things that Jeffery Lurie harped on was that he believes that the culture in this place is very special. And like, deep down, there's a way to build a Philadelphia Eagles team. And I think he believes that Nick is the right guy to do that. Like, that passion element fits with Philadelphia Eagles fans, man. Like, as much as people want to say that, hey, you don't want your head coach to do it, folks, we're doing the same thing when we're sitting on our couch yelling at the TV, right? I kind of like it. I enjoy seeing Nick Sirianni getting after it, but you have to be accountable, Nick Sirianni. This is the year. This is the year that he has to go out and be accountable. And that's a good thing, because you're really going to see who can sink or swim in those years. And I love that Jeffrey is giving him the trust. And those words that he said today are going to play dividends, not just now, but down the road for how your organization operates, right? Like, that you're willing to give guys the opportunity to go and take risks. How many times have we seen Howie take a risk? Jalen Hurts isn't here without Howie Roseman taking a risk and Nick Sirianni buying in. So I'm glad to hear the things that Jeffery Lurie had to say today. I'm glad he didn't have to talk about Kelly Green jerseys, because we got him. And also, Lou, does this guy listen to the Locked On Eagles podcast? Because what he said about Saquon Barkley was verbatim what we discussed a week ago.
Bit. Yeah, I was feeling good. My ego was pretty big, because I remember, like, right after the combine, we said, how does Howie zig when the rest of the league zags? And I mentioned the running back position, and he almost said what we said to a
dude. It was pretty close.
It was crazy. Yeah, no, that was a cool moment for sure. Just talking about the market inefficiency, taking advantage of that, only doing this really for a pass friendly weapon in the backfield. Mentioning LaShawn McCoy and Brian Westbrook in the same breath, that was super interesting. But yeah, it sounds like Gino again. He's very confident still in that top pillar of Howie Roseman, Jalen Hurts, and Nick Sirianni. Like, he mentioned that he loves the authenticity, as you mentioned, of Sirianni on the sidelines. He thinks Jalen Hurts is a great leader, and he doesn't want him to be anybody but his stoic genuine self. Like, he thinks he's a great leader, and it sounds like he's still very confident in those three running his organization. And so I shouldn't say again that I was surprised of that confidence, just maybe the level of enthusiasm he had for it.
I want to say I want Jeffery Lurie to talk more. I enjoy hearing what he has to say. I think he's a very good public speaker. I think he has a very good pulse on the state of the sport, and especially the state of Philadelphia Eagles fans and the whole state of the organization, because he says a lot of things that we want to hear, man. And I'm glad he will say good things about people, but then hold them accountable. He will always give you the yin and yang of everything. And even with the Jalen Hurts thing, he's like, yeah, you can love him for being a stoic, but then at the same time, there are people that will harp on him and say, oh, you want him to be over the top. But then in the moments when he's over the top, you want him to be stoic. So Jeffery Lurie,
no, he's good at looking at both sides. He
is like very good
the
at
10-1 start. Because again, I didn't like that. I feel like a little bit. And Howie Roseman even has toned this offseason. I feel like they've been bypassing the skid a little bit too much and trying to move on almost too quickly and just not talking about it. But at the same time, it was cool to hear Lurie mention, like, at the 10-1 start, he kept saying to himself, like, why aren't we closing teams out so early? Like, we won a lot of games. Maybe we should have lost. And it is cool to see that even in wins, like, because when he said, well, Nick Sirianni's 31-7, I'm like, okay, yes. But again, wins and losses, you need to add context. And it's good to know your owner does add context, because I don't think that's the case across the league and maybe even some teams in this division.
I mean, how many lessons has he learned over the years of having Andy Reid? And maybe he should have pushed the pedal a little bit earlier.
Well, he could have pointed to record to keep Chip Kelly. I mean, again, I think he's learned a lot along the way.
For sure. And the Doug situation absolutely got them to where they are here. And maybe if you don't fire Doug as early as you do and Doug's never there, Nick is the guy that's fired after 3 seasons, and he's the guy who sets the tone for what the coach is going to be. And maybe Jeffery in his old age is learning. I mean, he's still very chipper and understands like the state of everything. So he's going to be around the sport forever. And I'm glad that there isn't this like checks and balances. Everybody's fighting for power. What it was a decade ago when Howie's in the back building and Chip's leaving and we're trying to figure out where they are. I think they have a very good foundation from the head of the organization to the head of the guy bringing in the players to the guy that's coaching the players and the guy that's leading the players. I mean, they have the 4 pillars of what you need. Like your owner, GM, head coach, and quarterback are all on the same page, it seems, right? Hopefully.
I would say the owner, the GM, and the head coach are. The quarterback and the head coach is where I'm still skeptical after Sirianni's. It sounded like Lurie was a lot more confident in those two than Sirianni. I'm not saying Sirianni's not confident in Hurts, but that relationship, the comments, he had an opportunity to say, like, Jalen's my guy, like, our relationship's great, and he just did not say that. But again, honestly, Gino, normally that relationship's the most important in the organization, but I almost don't care about it as much as long as Hurts' relationship with Kellen Moore and the play caller is great. Like, that was, I think, the bigger issue last year was Hurts and Brian Johnson, not Hurts and Nick.
Yeah, and winning will cure a lot of things. And I'm sure once they get back,
I would say those two are like polar opposites. When things are not going well, it doesn't surprise me at all that they're not vibing.
Well, that's another like yin and yang element, man. I mean, like, how so different are all 4 of those individuals, right? Like Howie's so analytic and Nick is so focused on just who he is passionately and
over the top. And
then Howie and Jalen are just like, or Jeffery and Jalen are kind of just like a nice middle to both of them, and they kind of just keep them in sync. And I'm a little more forward on the Nick Sirianni, Jalen Hurts thing is just kind of the last taste that everybody has in their mouth. So, of course, everybody's still going to be a little upset at it.
All right, let's talk some rule changes coming up next. The NFL's been making some moves. We'll get into it right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast.
But first, today's edition of LOE is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets. I mean, heck, we're halfway through the tournament now. I'm sure your bracket was busted on Thursday, maybe even the playing games. But guess what? There's one place where you can bet on every single game. The board is chalky, but guess what? You can go and bet on anything. If you don't want to bet a winner or loser, you can bet on over-unders and player props and the whole 9. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. What does that mean? You pick a bet, put it in Abraham Lincoln. If that bet wins, you're going to get 40 times your initial investment. That's $200 to use on point spread, money line, and you can even pick who's going to win it all. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Once again, go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, and we thank Locked On for being the official sports book of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
All right, Gino, the NFL, they've made some rule changes over the last week, and I think some good, some maybe not so much, and that's what I want to get into. So I'm going to do this in a different way to finish off the show. Instead of just going through each one and getting in depth, I want to ask your opinion of all four as a X's and O's guy, true football guy. Gino again is our scouting director. I'm going to give you 4 rule changes. Give me love or hate, and then tell me why. I want to start with one that you've highlighted the last few years. It's the trade deadline being pushed back only 1 week, but going from week 8 to week 9. Love or hate?
I'm so on this one. I think,
yeah, all right. You can have a so as well. There could be a middle ground, sure.
The added week, it's progress. I think ultimately you need to get to a point that is kind of on par with the MLB, NBA, NHL, where you're closer to that 75% mark of the season than you are to the 50% mark.
11 or 12, maybe even. Or
I think when we get to double digits, we're going to be in good territory.
Yeah,
11 for me is, with the 17 games, prime, because you're still going to have 6 games after that to go to week 18 at that point. Teams are going to be on their bye. They might have 7 games to play. But at the point where you're only halfway through a season, teams don't know if they want to sink or swim. You have to get closer to that end point for teams to want to go all in. It's progress, kind of like that 2-helmet rule a couple years ago. It's a step in the right direction, but we're not to the Kelly Green jersey.
That's classic NFL. Yeah, they do something a little bit, see if it works, and then go all in. It feels like
100%.
Yeah, because again, moving the trade deadline back, it just gives more opportunities for more trades because teams are more willing to give up on playoff runs. So 1 week isn't great, but it's a start for sure. All right, the booth can review late hits on the quarterback and play clock expiring. Love or hate? I love both of these. I think this one's easy.
I love the play clock. That's easy. I think that's fine. That's a simple
rule. It always
rule.
Expires, man. I mean,
absolutely. And that goes into you could just put a little buzzer on it. It happens in quite literally every sport.
So easy
Lacrosse, it happens. Basketball has a shot clock. All of these sports have shot clocks. Why are we waiting for this clock to hit 0? Then we have to look at the clock, and then we have to subjectively say, did they get the snap off before
the ticky-tacky stuff like that, and even the chain gang eventually, to get rid of that stuff in football.
100%. I love the play call, or the play clock one. But getting into the VAR territory of was it late? Was it early when it comes to the hit? I'm a big fan of the Premier League. You turn on a Sunday lineup of games and something goes wrong because of VAR, video assisted refereeing. People have takes galore. So just wait for the first time this happens and something is overturned, people are going to.
But there are some egregious late hits.
Oh, there are. But then there's going to be some that you're like, okay, that's clean, and then they flag it. So
that's true. It might be like the pass interference thing a few years back, but I'll just never forget that Grady Jarrett hit on Tom Brady a few years ago, Falcons Buccaneers, and just that. It's just, any way to stop referees from making more mistakes and screwing up games, I'm all for, but I get your point for that one. Okay, the hip drop tackle being removed from the league, hate or love?
I think I'm okay with it. I'm not going to say I love the idea because I still think you're putting too much in the hands of the refereeing. But at the same time, I think there is a ridiculous amount of overreaction, seeing that every league that teaches high schoolers, middle schoolers, has shifted towards this rugby style of tackling. And it just seems like the NFL is the one league that just doesn't want to tackle correctly. I don't know. I think rugby tackling, it's been played for enough years that guys are running full speed all over the field from behind. You could just put your arms around them, and you don't have to drop your hip. You can literally put your arms and just continue to
but what are you supposed to do if you're a corner, if you're Nate Wiggins chasing Saquon Barkley from behind and that guy squats 600 pounds? I mean, what are you supposed to do?
Play another position? I don't know. That's it's
I kind of hate it. I hate it. I just think it's already tough enough. It's tough enough to play defense, and they're just, and again, some of the egregious hip drop tackles, if the obvious ones are there, I understand, but this is kind of another ticky-tack thing where I'm nervous there's just going to be some plays that I'm like, that seems like a clean tackle to me, and they're going to label it as this.
Right. There has to be a clear definition. Like, did the hit...
Like clear and obvious. Remember that? I'm getting PTSD to that pass.
That's what I'm saying. Like, more VAR type of stuff. But with the hip drop, I think it's going to protect offensive players. It's going to make it harder for defensive players. As every rule does. Why are we shocked? The NFL wants points. I know it sucks. But there's going to have to be... I feel bad for
Darius Slay, though, tweeting out that there's going to be a lot of missed tackles. He clearly did not read the room, got shredded for that, considering how bad the Eagles already were at tackling last year. Just definitely. Yeah,
maybe they should completely overhaul how they teach tackling in Philadelphia.
Yeah, Darius Slay got roasted for that one, for sure. I mean, he's had a bad offseason on Twitter. All right, last one, Gino, the kickoff, which is now going to be, so it's still at the 35-yard line, but the kickoff defending team, they line up at the opposing 40. They cannot run at the returner until the ball either hits the ground or the returner catches it. If the ball goes into the end zone, the ball does go up to the 30-yard line. If a player lets it trickle back, it goes into to the 15. And if it goes out of bounds, it goes to the 40. So it's trying to encourage kickoff returns, but trying not to still have the concussions of the past. So I actually love this one.
This is the one that I am 100% in love with.
This was the XFL rule, right?
Yes, this was the XFL
rule. Made it seem like they all got together and like made this new rule, but
dude,
they totally
they really ripped
like they said they got together with all these special teams coaches. I'm like, give me a break. No. This is the XFL's rule.
No, and shout out to Eric Gelko, director of the East West Shrine Bowl, who was with the XFL, part of that crew that really drummed this up. He put out a thread today that said before they even put it in action on the field, they were testing it for 2 years to figure out the real way. And hey, man, Vince McMahon in the original iteration got them to use the yellow line when it came to first downs.
True. Those leagues are good for something. It makes the NFL come up with some new rules.
I love it. And it is literally the Undertaker gif. Kick returners are alive again. Britton Covey is like, his job just doubled in stature. You're going to open it up for more guys to make the team because of special teams. And maybe you take a look at the way your returner is now. It's not so much, can you just find space in the open field? It's, can you make guys miss in a phone?
Yeah, this is more of like an offensive play now, Gino, where you're almost like reading the line of scrimmage. And I think this is going to be very pro running back now for returners.
It's going to be very good special teams coordinators that harp on rush lane integrity, that guys are going to have to keep their lanes when they are covering these kicks.
I love it.
At the same time, I think you said it in a very good way that it kind of is like a play, like how soon before we see teams running plays off of this. And I think Jeffery Lurie said it best. We saw 13 kickoffs in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it was embarrassing.
13 of them were touchbacks.
It's a waste. It's a
waste of play. Yeah. And
it's literally just an opportunity for them to play more commercials. That's really what it is.
Tell me you don't miss the years of Dante Hall being electric on a Monday when you turn on
or even in Philadelphia, like, Deshaun Jackson taking kicks back, or Darren Sproles. And I know that was punt returns, but heck, Chris Polk used to take them back. Wendell Smallwood and Josh Huff. Like, you haven't gotten that in so long. This will give just more opportunities for big plays, and that's what the NFL wants. So if those football leagues are good for something, Gino, they are forced to be creative to stay in business, and then it eventually forces the NFL to stay ahead and, adapt those rules if they do work out. So props to the XFL for getting this one into our league. That's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in and making us your first listen each and every day. We will be back Wednesday through Friday this week. Got some draft talk coming up tomorrow. Until then, for Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. Thank you so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.